It wasn't announced. It wasn't leaked. It arrived in silence. A sealed envelope. A private confirmation. And when the DINA results were finally revealed, Catherine, Princess of Wales, reportedly broke down in tears. Not from confusion, but recognition. Because what the test confirmed wasn't just biological truth. It confirmed something Princess Diana had taken to her grave. A final secret no one was ever meant to uncover. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The secrecy surrounding the DINA test was deliberate and absolute. This was not a casual inquiry or a speculative experiment. It was initiated quietly, shielded from the usual channels, and known only to a tightly controlled inner circle bound by silence. No paper trail meant for public eyes. No institutional acknowledgement. Those involved understood the stakes immediately. If the truth emerged without preparation, it could fracture more than reputations. It could rewrite history. Only a handful of people were aware the test even existed, and fewer still knew when the results would arrive. This wasn't about curiosity, it was about confirmation. Something unresolved had lingered for decades, and recent developments made it impossible to ignore any longer. What unsettled everyone involved was not the possibility of shock, but the possibility of recognition, the kind that lands instantly and leaves no room for denial. When Catherine saw the results, the emotional response was immediate and unguarded. Insiders describe a moment of stillness followed by tears that carried weight rather than surprise. This was not the reaction of someone learning something new. It was the reaction of someone finally seeing truth reflected back at them. The confirmation didn't feel foreign. It felt familiar, as though a missing piece had quietly snapped into place. The realization that Diana's secret was real and provable hit with a force that altered everything. Diana was no longer just a tragic figure shaped by circumstance. She became a woman who carried knowledge she could never reveal. That understanding reframed years of silence, contradictions, and choices that had long puzzled even those closest to her. For Catherine, the weight of that realization was deeply personal. It was no longer history. It was inheritance. This moment changed Catherine forever, because it collapsed distance. Diana was no longer a story told in fragments or filtered through public memory. She was present in the truth itself. The DINA confirmation transformed Catherine's role from observer to bearer, someone now holding knowledge that could not be shared without consequence. The tears reflected that burden as much as the revelation. Almost immediately, a decision was made to keep the results private. Not out of fear, but out of responsibility. Those involved understood that truth does not always demand exposure. Sometimes it demands care. The implications were too vast, the emotional cost too high, to allow the information to spill unchecked. Silence once again became a shield, but this time it was chosen with awareness rather than imposed by force. And yet, even as the results were secured and the room fell quiet, one reality remained unavoidable. Secrets of this magnitude do not stay buried forever. They surface because they are meant to. And when they do, they change the people who uncover them long before they change the world. But to understand why these results carried such power, we must return to the whispers that followed Diana for decades. For years, rumors clung to Diana like a shadow, questions never answered, contradictions never resolved. The world saw glamour and tragedy, but behind it all were quiet whispers the palace worked tirelessly to suppress. Diana never addressed them publicly. She didn't need to, because the truth, according to insiders, was always more dangerous than the speculation. The rumors were never just gossip, they were patterns that refused to settle. Stories that resurfaced despite official denials. Details that didn't quite align with the version the public was meant to accept. Each time a question gained traction, it was met with a familiar response: dismissal, distraction, and silence. The palace understood something crucial. Speculation burns fast, but truth endures. So the strategy was containment, not confrontation. Certain questions were conspicuously left unanswered, not because answers didn't exist, but because providing them would have opened doors that could never be closed again. The absence of clarity became intentional. Over time, that absence shaped the narrative just as much as any statement ever could. Diana's story was curated carefully, with emphasis placed on what could be mourned rather than what might be questioned. Diana's silence, often interpreted as vulnerability or restraint, was in fact deliberate. Insiders suggest she understood the difference between speaking and surviving. To confirm the truth would have invited consequences far beyond personal fallout. It would have threatened stability, legitimacy, and the fragile balance she navigated daily. Silence was not weakness, it was strategy. A way to protect something larger, even at the cost of her own peace. Over the years, subtle clues slipped through the cracks. A hesitation in an interview. A carefully chosen phrase in a private letter. A shift in behavior that, in hindsight, felt loaded with meaning. None of it was definitive on its own, but together it formed a quiet trail. Those closest to Diana sensed it. Observers dismissed it. But the feeling persisted that something vital was being shielded from view. The palace's efforts to control speculation only reinforced that belief. The harder certain topics were pushed away, the more significant they seemed. Rumours faded, then returned, slightly altered but unmistakably familiar. Each return chipped away at the certainty of the official story. The idea took hold that speculation wasn't being silenced because it was false, but because it was uncomfortably close to the truth. As years passed, the whispers outlived their source. Diana was gone, but the questions remained. They lingered in public memory, resurfacing at moments of transition and change, and with each generation, the context shifted. What once felt dangerous to ask began to feel necessary. The passage of time didn't erase doubt, it sharpened it. Eventually, the belief grew that something had been actively protected. Not an image, not a reputation, but a reality too destabilizing to acknowledge openly. Diana's life, it seemed, had been shaped not only by what she endured, but by what she carried in silence. And silence, when stretched across decades, develops a gravity of its own. And decades later, one question refused to stay buried, prompting an investigation no one expected. This wasn't curiosity, it was necessity. According to sources, the decision to run a DNA test came after inconsistencies surfaced, details that no longer aligned with the official story. Quiet consultations turned into urgent discussions, and eventually, a line was crossed that could never be uncrossed. Science was about to answer what the palace never would. The renewed scrutiny did not arrive with fanfare. It crept in through discrepancies that refused to reconcile themselves. Timelines that drifted. Records that contradicted long-held assumptions. Small questions multiplied until they demanded a single definitive response. For years, those questions had been set aside as inconvenient or speculative. Now, they felt too precise to ignore. The past was no longer staying put, and the present was beginning to feel unstable because of it. Behind the scenes, sources suggest a small group pressed for scientific confirmation, not to provoke scandal, but to end uncertainty. This was not driven by ambition or curiosity, but by a growing fear that the truth, if left unexamined, would surface in less controlled ways. The discussions were careful, restrained, and deeply uneasy. Everyone involved understood the risk. Once evidence is sought, it cannot be unseen. Once confirmed, it cannot be unconfirmed. What made this moment feel too dangerous to ignore was timing. The monarchy had entered a phase where legacy and succession mattered more than ever. Old questions carried new weight. The idea that unresolved truth could shadow future leadership was unacceptable. Silence, once protective, now felt like exposure. The calculation shifted from whether the truth should be known to whether it could afford not to be. The secrecy surrounding the testing process was absolute. No institutional acknowledgement. No traceable authorization. The operation was insulated from routine oversight to prevent interference or leakage. Every step was designed to minimize visibility and maximize control. This was not about bypassing protocol for convenience, it was about safeguarding against chaos. The fewer people who knew, the safer the process remained. Yet even with precautions, the emotional risk loomed large. Uncovering the truth meant confronting consequences that extended beyond reputations. It meant reopening wounds that had never fully healed. It meant forcing individuals to reconsider what they believed they knew about their own history. The fear was not of scandal alone, but of grief of confirming something that would change how loss itself was understood. Catherine was informed before anyone else for a reason. Insiders suggest it was not about rank, but about trust. She represented continuity, empathy, and the future. If the results carried emotional weight, she needed to be prepared. The choice acknowledged her role not just as a public figure, but as a custodian of truth that could not be shared lightly. In that moment, she was not being protected from the truth, she was being entrusted with it. As the process moved forward, the tension became unbearable. Everyone involved sensed that the outcome would not merely answer questions, it would redefine them. The test was no longer a precaution, it was an inevitability. And as the final confirmation approached, the weight of anticipation settled heavily, charged with the knowledge that whatever emerged would change everything. But no one was prepared for what the results would actually confirm. The results didn't raise questions, they ended them. The Dina confirmation aligned with a theory Diana had quietly lived with, but never spoken aloud. A truth so explosive that revealing it during her lifetime could have shattered the monarchy beyond repair. This was not scandal for gossip's sake. This was legacy-altering truth. What the results definitively confirmed did not arrive with ambiguity or margin for interpretation. It closed a door the palace had kept carefully ajar for decades, relying on uncertainty to protect stability. Science replaced speculation with certainty, and in doing so stripped away the protective fog that had long surrounded Diana's most guarded reality. What once lived as rumor now stood with the weight of proof, immune to dismissal or reframing. The danger this truth posed to Diana cannot be overstated. During her lifetime, even a whisper in the wrong direction carried consequences. Confirmation would have placed her at the center of a crisis she could never win. Every relationship, every role, every expectation would have been recast through a lens of suspicion and threat. The risk was not merely reputational, it was existential. Diana understood that survival sometimes depended not on telling the truth, but on knowing when not to. Seen through this new clarity, Diana's choices and behavior take on sharper meaning. Her guardedness no longer reads as distance. Her silences no longer feel evasive, they feel protective. Decisions once criticized as emotional or erratic now appear calculated, shaped by the burden of knowing too much in a system that could not afford honesty. What was once labeled fragility reveals itself as endurance. The emotional burden Diana carried alone becomes painfully clear. To hold a truth of this magnitude without relief, without validation, without acknowledgement, is to live in a constant state of restraint. Every public appearance required composure. Every private moment required vigilance. There was no safe space to exhale fully. The cost of that isolation was invisible, but it was relentless, pressing in quietly until it shaped the very way she moved through the world. This explains why the palace feared the truth more than the rumor. Rumors can be dismissed, redirected, and diluted. Truth cannot. Once confirmed, it demands reckoning. It forces accountability where silence once sufficed. The institution understood that exposure would not simply embarrass, it would destabilize. Structures built on tradition and assumption are weakest when confronted with evidence that contradicts their foundations. The confirmation that silence had been intentional reframes everything. This was not neglect. It was containment. Diana's silence was mirrored by the palace's own, a mutual understanding forged under pressure. The difference was choice. The institution chose preservation. Diana chose protection of her children, of the crown, of a future she would never fully inhabit. The dinar result does not accuse. It reveals. It shows that silence was not imposed alone. It was negotiated by necessity. With the truth now undeniable, the past cannot be rewritten, but it can be understood. The confirmation does not diminish Diana's legacy. It clarifies it. It shows a woman navigating an impossible landscape with the only tool available to her restraint. And in that restraint lies the quiet courage the world never fully recognized. And when Catherine realized what Diana had endured, the emotional impact became overwhelming. This wasn't shock. It was empathy. Catherine reportedly didn't cry because of the revelation itself, but because she understood it. In that moment, Diana stopped being a distant figure and became something else entirely. A woman trapped by duty, secrecy, and fear, and Catherine saw herself reflected in that reality. The emotional response unfolded privately, away from any audience, stripped of ceremony and expectation. Insiders describe a silence that lingered longer than expected, followed by tears that came slowly, deliberately, as if carrying years of unspoken understanding. This was not an emotional collapse. It was recognition settling into the body. Catherine wasn't reacting to new information. She was reacting to a lived truth she suddenly realized had been shared across generations. What made the confirmation feel deeply personal was the mirror it held up to her own life. Catherine has long navigated the careful balance between visibility and restraint, learning when to speak and when silence protects more than words ever could. Seeing Diana's choices through this new lens reframed that discipline not as limitation, but as survival. The truth revealed how closely their paths aligned not in circumstance, but in consequence. Parallels between their lives surfaced with unsettling clarity. Both women entered the institution under intense scrutiny. Both were shaped by expectation before being fully understood. Both learned quickly that vulnerability carried a cost, and that composure was not optional, it was armor. Diana's burden, once perceived as tragic isolation, now looked like a familiar weight Catherine herself had learned to carry quietly. The realization brought with it the weight of inheritance, not of title or position, but of responsibility. Catherine understood that Diana's unspoken burden had not ended with her. It had passed forward, transformed but unresolved. To know the truth meant to hold it. To hold it meant to protect it. And protection, in this world, often demands silence. The tears reflected the acceptance of that role as much as the pain of understanding it. This moment altered how Catherine viewed her place within the monarchy. The future was no longer abstract, it was personal. The role she would one day occupy now carried deeper meaning, shaped by lessons Diana was never allowed to teach openly. Catherine did not see herself as repeating history, but as completing a cycle one defined by awareness rather than ignorance, by choice rather than confinement. Insiders describe a quiet moment that followed, one that felt decisive rather than emotional. A pause, a breath, a recalibration. It was the moment Catherine moved from witness to guardian, from recipient of truth to steward of it. The tears stopped, but the understanding remained, settling into resolve. This was not a breaking point, it was a turning point. What emerged from that private reckoning was not fear, but clarity. Catherine did not retreat from the truth, she absorbed it. She recognized the cost of silence, but also its power. Diana's story no longer felt incomplete. It felt entrusted, and that trust reshaped Catherine's sense of duty, grounding it in empathy rather than obligation. But Catherine wasn't the only one shaken by the confirmation. For Prince William, The confirmation didn't just rewrite history, it rewrote memory. Moments from his childhood suddenly carried new meaning. Silences felt louder, absences felt deliberate, and the realization that his mother had carried this truth alone reportedly left him shaken, angry, and deeply protective. The processing was not immediate. Insiders describe a period of quiet intensity, where familiar recollections replayed themselves under a harsher light. Innocent gaps in memory now felt intentional. Ordinary moments gained weight. What once seemed like distance began to look like restraint. William wasn't just absorbing information, he was reinterpreting his past, realizing that much of what he had accepted as circumstance was, in fact, consequence. This reframing reshaped how he understood Diana herself. She was no longer only the mother he lost, or the figure immortalized by the world's grief. She became a woman navigating an invisible threat, making decisions shaped by a truth she could never reveal. Her protectiveness, her urgency, her private intensity, all of it began to align. The confirmation did not complicate her legacy for William, it clarified it. It explained the choices that had once puzzled him, and illuminated the courage behind them. Anger followed understanding. Not reckless anger, but controlled and focused. It was directed toward the system that allowed such a burden to be carried in silence, toward those who chose containment over care. William reportedly struggled with the knowledge that this truth had been known, managed and buried, while his mother bore the cost alone. The idea that protection had come at the expense of honesty left a bitter aftertaste that did not fade quickly. That anger sharpened into resolve when it turned toward the present. William's instinct was immediate and unmistakable. Catherine would never be allowed to endure the same isolation. The parallels between Diana and Catherine were impossible to ignore, and the confirmation only reinforced his determination to shield his family from repeating history. Protection, in this sense, became more than instinct, it became policy. A line drawn with intention. This moment strengthened his resolve as a future king in ways no briefing ever could. Leadership, he realized, is not only about stability but about responsibility, not only about continuity but about correction. The confirmation forced him to confront the cost of silence and the danger of preserving systems that demand it. What he inherited was not just a crown, but a lesson one paid for in years of unspoken suffering. Insiders speak of a quiet vow made in private. No declaration. No grand gesture, just a commitment shaped by clarity. A promise that truth would not always be deferred, that protection would not require erasure, that the institution could evolve without denying the people within it. It was a vow born not from ambition, but from understanding the price of neglect. As William absorbed the weight of this revelation, the implications stretched beyond personal grief. They touched the core of governance, of trust, of how power decides what deserves to be known. The confirmation did more than reopen wounds, it exposed the mechanisms that kept them hidden. And once exposed, those mechanisms could no longer be ignored. Which raises an even more dangerous question: why was this secret hidden for so long? Secrets of this magnitude don't survive by accident. They are protected, managed, buried. Insiders suggest Diana's final secret was one the palace actively worked to suppress, not to protect her, but to protect the institution. And now, decades later, that silence is beginning to look less like discretion and more like control. The alleged management of the truth followed a familiar pattern: isolate the risk, limit exposure, and allow time to do the rest. Information was compartmentalized, conversations narrowed, and responsibility diluted across layers of authority, so no single hand appeared to be guiding the outcome. In this way, the secret didn't disappear, it was absorbed, folded into routine, treated as something to be contained rather than confronted. What mattered most was not the human cost, but the preservation of continuity. Revealing the truth during Diana's lifetime would have destabilized the crown in ways few were prepared to handle. It would have raised questions that tradition could not answer, and demanded transparency the institution was not designed to provide. The monarchy relies on certainty, on symbols that endure, because they are not interrogated too closely. A confirmed truth of this scale would have forced scrutiny where silence once sufficed, exposing fault lines that could not be quickly repaired. This is where the line between protection and suppression blurred. Protection implies care for the individual. Suppression implies prioritizing structure over person. Insiders suggest that while the language used was always about safeguarding Diana, the actions taken consistently favored the institution. Silence was framed as kindness, restraint as duty. But over time, that framing hardened into policy, and Diana's voice became collateral damage in a larger strategy of control. There are indications that more people knew than history acknowledges. Not everyone knew everything, but enough knew enough. Partial awareness spread across advisory circles, creating a shared understanding without shared accountability. This diffusion ensured the secret's survival while absolving individuals of responsibility. No one person carried the blame, but Diana carried the burden. And that burden shaped the remainder of her life in ways the public never fully saw. The cost of keeping Diana silent was profound. It demanded emotional isolation, constant vigilance, and the suppression of truth even in private moments. The institution continued, stable and intact, while the individual absorbed the strain. Over time, that imbalance deepened. The crown remained protected, but the price was paid in quiet suffering. The absence of scandal was treated as success, even as the human toll mounted invisibly. So why did the truth resurface now? Timing, insiders suggest, is everything. The monarchy is changing. Expectations are shifting. The future demands accountability in ways the past did not. What once could be buried by tradition is now challenged by scrutiny, technology, and a public less willing to accept silence as explanation. The conditions that allowed the secret to remain hidden no longer exist. As layers peel back, the old logic falters. Silence no longer guarantees stability, it invites suspicion. Control no longer ensures preservation, it accelerates reckoning. The truth did not resurface because someone wanted it to, it resurfaced because the system that buried it could no longer hold. And as the truth emerges, the monarchy faces a reckoning it can no longer avoid. This revelation doesn't live in the past, it lives in the future. It reshapes trust, legacy, and the emotional foundation of the modern monarchy. Catherine's tears were not weakness, they were warning. Because when Diana's final secret came to light, it exposed cracks the crown can no longer ignore. The long-term implications for royal legitimacy are profound. Institutions survive on confidence, and confidence is built on coherent stories that hold together under scrutiny. When a truth of this magnitude emerges, it doesn't merely challenge one chapter, it tests the entire narrative. The monarchy now faces a future where authority must be earned through candor as much as tradition. Stability, once maintained by silence, now depends on trust that can withstand disclosure. This moment also alters Diana's historical legacy in a way time never could. She is no longer remembered solely through tragedy or charisma, but through clarity. The confirmation reframes her life as one marked by restraint under pressure, courage without applause, and choices made to protect a future she would never fully inhabit. History shifts from speculation to understanding, and with that shift comes accountability for the institution that benefited from her silence. Catherine's role evolves in response. No longer just a bridge between past and future, she becomes a steward of truth shaped by empathy. The knowledge she carries informs how she listens, how she leads, and how she protects those around her. Her composure now holds a deeper purpose, grounded not in performance, but in resolve. This is the quiet emergence of a future queen who understands the cost of silence and the power of care. William's determination to rule differently takes sharper focus. Leadership, in this context, is no longer about preserving appearances, it is about correcting course. The lesson is unmistakable. Systems that demand silence eventually fracture. His resolve reflects a monarchy intent on learning rather than repeating, on choosing transparency where secrecy once seemed safer. It is not rebellion against tradition, but refinement of it. Outside the palace, the public's demand for truth continues to grow. Audiences are no longer satisfied with curated narratives that avoid difficult questions. They want coherence, honesty, and accountability that feels human. The confirmation accelerates that expectation, forcing the institution to meet a standard shaped by modern values without abandoning its core identity. This balance will define the monarchy's relevance in the years ahead. As a result, the crown is being forced into emotional transparency. Not confession, but acknowledgement. Not spectacle, but sincerity. The shift is subtle but unmistakable, an understanding that resilience is strengthened by truth, not threatened by it. The emotional architecture of the monarchy, how it communicates, how it listens, how it responds, must adapt to survive. What emerges is not collapse, but transformation. A recognition that legitimacy in the modern age flows from integrity as much as inheritance. The revelation compels a reimagining of power less insulated, more accountable, and ultimately more durable. The cracks exposed are not an ending, they are an invitation to rebuild with intention. Because once a secret like this is confirmed, the story doesn't end, it transforms. Diana's final secret waited decades to surface, not because it was forgotten, but because the time wasn't right. Until now. The Dina test didn't create the truth. It released it, and as Catherine wiped away tears, one thing became clear. Diana's voice may have been silenced, but her truth never was. This revelation surfaced now because the conditions that once kept it buried no longer exist. Time shifted the balance, the monarchy evolved, expectations hardened. What was once too destabilizing to acknowledge became too consequential to ignore. Generations passed, and with them the fear that silence would protect the future. In its place grew a different fear that unresolved truth would poison it. The moment arrived not by chance, but by readiness. For Diana, the closure never came. She lived with knowledge that demanded restraint, and left the world without the relief of acknowledgement. That absence lingered, unresolved, shaping memory without ever offering resolution. The confirmation does not give her peace retroactively, but it restores dignity to her choices. It explains the weight she carried and honors the discipline it took to carry it alone. Closure, delayed, arrives not as apology, but as understanding. There is symbolism in science revealing what power concealed. Where influence negotiated silence, evidence speaks plainly. The Dina test stands as a quiet equalizer immune to spin, untouched by tradition. It does not accuse, it clarifies. In doing so, it reframes the relationship between truth and authority. The message is simple and unsettling. Facts wait patiently, and when they emerge, they change the rules. Secrets like this do not end with one generation, they echo. Generational trauma takes shape in habits silence learned, caution inherited, fear normalized. The truth reshapes those patterns. It explains behaviors passed down without explanation and offers a chance to interrupt them. Understanding becomes a form of healing, not because it erases pain, but because it names it. The cost of silence across generations is now visible. It shows up in guarded conversations, in choices made to avoid conflict, in the emotional labor required to maintain appearances. Silence preserved stability, but it exacted a toll that compounded over time. The revelation exposes that cost and forces a reckoning with how protection can slip into erasure when left unexamined. This story will never fully disappear because it touches something universal, the tension between truth and survival. It will resurface in questions, in comparisons, in moments when the monarchy faces decisions that demand clarity over comfort. The confirmation does not close a chapter, it opens a lens. Through it, the past is reread and the future reconsidered. What remains is not scandal, but responsibility, to carry truth with care, to choose transparency without spectacle, to allow understanding to replace speculation. Diana's truth waited, and when it arrived, it did not shout. It simply stood, unavoidable, unchanged, and finally, seen, because some truths don't fade with time, they wait. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.